Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Understanding and Improving Your Mobile Web Performance. My name is Madalena Viti. I am the Marketing Programs Manager at Mobify, and I will be your host. A few housekeeping items before I introduce our speaker. We will be sending a recording of the webinar later today, and if you have any questions during the webinar, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Today, we are joined by Mobify's Chief Technical Officer and co-founder, John Boxall. In his role, John is focused on building Mobify's platform to deliver fast, reliable, and future-proof multi-channel solutions to our customers and partners. And with that, I will pass it to John.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Madalena. I appreciate the introduction. Hey, everyone. I am super stoked to be talking today about understanding and improving mobile web performance. To get things started off, I just wanted to talk a little bit about our agenda. So, I'm hoping to go through a few things over the course of today. One of the first things I want to talk about is just contrasting a little bit of how sometimes businesses, retailers, and brands think about performance as opposed to how customers might view the performance of your website. I want to talk a little bit about tools to measure performance, and I'm going to bust out into my web browser here and try to show some of them off live. Then I want to get into some performance best practices. So I kind of want to give you, 5 actionable tips today to take away to your teams to start working on improving your performance. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that Mobify has been up to with accelerated mobile pages and progressive web apps, some new technologies that are allowing us to deliver really quick, really fast experiences. And after there, we'll head into the Q&A. So with that, let's get started. So to begin with, why don't we think a little bit about how customers typically perceive performance of their sites? So when you think about performance as a brand, as a retailer, usually there's 3 things that folks are usually thinking about. They're thinking, is this site making money? Are my shoppers purchasing? And are my customers engaged? And there's a variety of metrics that you might use to measure these things, from revenue to your retention rate or number of signups on your site. And these are really great things to be aware of. But how folks visiting your site think about performance is actually quite a bit different. So when a shopper arrives at a site, a lot of times there's kind of 3 big things that are going to help them understand whether it's performant or not. They'll think about whether it's easy to use. They'll think about whether it loads quickly, and they'll think about how fast it feels when they interact with it. So in terms of easy to use, a lot of what we think about is how quickly can a customer understand the page that they're on, orient themselves, and find where to go next. So we think about a bunch of things under that, like the number of steps that it might take to complete a particular task, the complexity of navigation, how easily folks can understand product descriptions and product listings to find the right thing. We think about it also in terms of forms, like let's say you're heading through a checkout or another place where you need to enter information. One way we measure how difficult a site is to use is by the number of errors that a shopper might make. So all the way through this, we're thinking about, how can we reduce the cognitive burden on a shopper when we're looking to make the site more easy to use. And there's a number of standard metrics that you're probably already tracking, using your analytics suite today. This could be things like bounce rate. Bounce measures whether a shopper leaves your site after accessing a single page. A high bounce rate might indicate that folks are not finding your site easy to use because they're unable to understand what their next action should be. Another way you might look to measure whether a site is easy to use is via cart abandonment rate. So when you have a shopper coming in and moving through a checkout flow, if they're leaving that checkout flow, maybe because they're finding it difficult to enter their address correctly or select the shipping options that you want. So these sorts of things can help us understand whether a website is easy to use. Another way that shoppers think about how fast the website is whether it loads quickly. So when you think about typing in a address in your web browser or clicking a link from Google search results, we think about how quickly that page actually renders. If we're loading fonts or images or other assets, how quickly do they appear? A big thing for web page loading is whether elements appear in the right order as well. If you've been to a bunch of news sites lately, one thing you might see is when different advertising banners load in, the site pops around and reflows as those elements appear in the viewport. The other thing that can be important here is just showing users some indication of progress. So sometimes you're stuck on a screen and it's not entirely clear whether things are actually working or not. So these sorts of things might be measured by, first paint, first contentful paint, first meaningful paint, or time to interactive, which are all kind of technical metrics. I actually wanted to bust out just to one of my favorite sites for a minute that can illustrate, some of these metrics, because these are metrics that are fired at different points in a page's life cycle, and it can kind of be different for different sites. So there's a great resource that a company called SpeedCurve has made around understanding and picking rendering metrics. They use some large web properties to help you understand when exactly these different rendering metrics would be fired. So for example, here's Google, and they're showing the various stages of loading and the sorts of metrics that would be fired at a particular point. So you can see here, when the search bar for Google starts to appear, that's the time things like start render, first meaningful paint, first paint, or first contentful paint would be emitted by the browser. Hero rendering time refers to large assets that typically, visually make up a big chunk of the page. So in this case, once the Google banner is loaded, that's considered to be the hero is rendered. Speed index measures, the rendering of a page over time. It's a bit of a complicated metric to explain, so I'm going to leave that one there right now. But time to first interactive is a metric that measures not only that a page has been rendered, but also any JavaScript that would add dynamic functionality to the website has been loaded. So we can just look at a few other sites really quickly to understand that. Say on YouTube, when video thumbnails start to load on, we see the first meaningful paint firing. Once the main video that they're showing loads, that's when first interactive runs. So this is a great resource that we'll fire out afterwards to folks, but this can help you understand some of the specific times that these metrics would be fired. So the final thing that shoppers are usually thinking about when they're looking at their site is whether it feels fast. So in particular, this comes up a lot if you have someone interact with an element on your site and it seems like nothing happens. So this is the kind of that you tap the site and you're not sure whether something actually happened. The second way that this often shows up for shoppers is if you're scrolling through a web page and scrolling doesn't feel smooth. Scrolling feels like something is inhibiting it, something is making that scrolling janky. So there's usually two kinds of ways that we can measure this. First input delay is a way that web browsers look at when you make an input, when you touch your phone, when you try to interact with an element. How long does it take from the time that you interacted for the site to actually respond? And long tasks are things where we have execution going on in the background of our site, and that might interrupt smooth scrolling experiences. So those are some kind of specific metrics. I wanted to talk about a more general metric as well. One thing we've been thinking about a bunch at Mobify is the need to kind of combine all these different kinds of usability metrics into a single metric that we can talk about. So for some time, we've been thinking about a metric we're calling time to task completion. So time to task completion is the time that it takes for a shopper to complete a particular task. And we really like it because it combines some of the technical performance aspects of a website with a user experience. So just to give you kind of a specific example here, if you imagine a task that a shopper needs to complete, like finding a particular item on a website, usually that involves not just navigating to a single page, but navigating to multiple pages. And this is really cool because it tests not just the performance of our pages, how quickly they load, but also how quickly a shopper can understand and perceive where they need to go next. So we get to test a lot of the usability of our site as well. So a time to task completion test is going to give us a great idea of how successful shoppers are overall and combine those three different things that we might be looking at. So just to go into a really particular example here, earlier I mentioned a findability task. So if you think about a common retail site, maybe with a number of different products, a shopper might be looking, to find a particular one. When they first arrive on the site via a Google search result or maybe a social media link, the website needs to load. After the website's loaded, they actually need to expend mental energy, understanding the navigation of the site, validating that they're in the right place, and then looking to navigate to potentially a product list page. From there, you're going to go through that loading cycle again, and that's going to go on as you maneuver your way through the site, going back and forth between these things. And in each one of these steps, we're going to test how quickly the website loads, how quickly the shopper can perceive what action to take, and how quickly the site responds to the action that they're going to take. So time to task completion is a really great, overall way of measuring different aspects of your performance. But today I wanted to actually focus on some of the technical measures that go into and inform time to task completion. So I want to spend a lot of my time talking about some leading indicators of time to task completion and the specific tools that you might use to do that. So thinking about different kinds of metrics and things that you might use to measure those different kinds of performance, I really think about three sets of overall techniques. So for something like time to task completion, typically we're using usability tests as our measurement technique. So today there doesn't necessarily exist great software for implementing usability tests. So we actually have to talk to people, and get kind of our UX researchers, get folks in a room with shoppers and ask them to actually complete a task and measure and record what those individuals are doing. So, that's very useful to do, but that's also a little bit of a lagging indicator of performance. So how can we understand more quickly how our site is performing? So when I think about all those different technical timing metrics, typically I'm thinking about two ways to measure and evaluate them. So one set of measurements I call laboratory tests, and the other set I call field tests. So lab tests are all about creating a controlled environment and running a test in a really specific circumstance. By controlling for a bunch of different factors, we can get a really close eye on exactly what's impacting our performance. So sometimes folks will call lab tests synthetic tests because they're not designed to test real-world conditions, but they are designed to give us a really good eye quickly for the kinds of performance that we're seeing. I contrast that a little bit with field tests. So typically the kinds of metrics we're measuring in field tests, user timing, hero element timing, time to interactive, these are things that we can also measure in lab tests. The difference is where we're actually doing the tests themselves. So instead of running in a laboratory and controlling for as many variables as possible, field tests are actually run out in the wild. So they're ran on the devices of actual users. And what we're looking to do in field tests is understand whether there's any outliers for performance. So a lot of times what we'll find is our laboratory tests missed some specific conditions that are present with shoppers or folks out in the wild. For example, we might have customers using devices that we never imagined. And those devices might have a different performance profile because they have different memory, CPU, or network conditions. So field testing is going to allow us to understand, how performance is actually distributed across our entire user tests. So just focusing in a bit more on, where you would use lab and field tests and some of the challenges with them. Lab tests are a great gate, a great quality gate to prevent teams from releasing changes that would introduce performance regressions. I'm going to spend some time talking about how you can work lab tests into your, change processes to prevent performance regressions from creeping into your site. Really, the big challenge with lab tests for most folks is just making sure that it's correctly integrated into their change process in such a way that it can't easily be bypassed or forgotten. So I'll give some tips for that today too. For field tests, again, the value there is in understanding kind of performance profiles of distinct groups of the population of your overall customers. The real challenge with field tests, though, is often you're sorting through a massive amount of data. So understanding the signal from the noise can be a little bit challenging there. So let's dig into some tools that we're specifically using for lab and field tests at Mobify and see how we can use them to measure some of these performance metrics. So one tool, that's received a lot of popularity over the last couple of years is Google's Lighthouse. Lighthouse is billed as a linter for the web or a tool for ensuring that websites are adhering to best practices. What does a Lighthouse report actually look like? Well, it looks something a little bit like this. So this is kind of the result that you get when you run Lighthouse on a particular site. And we can see here that it actually gives us scores across a number of different categories. But the category that I'm interested in focusing on today is the performance category. So I'm actually going to bust out into my web browser and show kind of a live interactive example of a performance report from Lighthouse. So here again, we can see a performance report from Lighthouse and those different categories. In particular, the performance category is the one that I'm going to focus on. So what we can see here is that Lighthouse is actually exposing a number of different metrics for us to kind of review. So some of the ones we talked about earlier, first contentful paint, first meaningful paint, speed index, time to interactive, these are all exposed to us, along with a nice film strip down here so we can kind of understand how our site is loading. Below that, we actually also see a number of recommendations about the sorts of things that we could do to improve our performance. If we can go ahead and make all those improvements, Lighthouse also has this really nice fireworks feature, which is totally worth trying really hard to get those hundreds on. The really nice thing about Lighthouse is it's actually built into the Google Chrome web browser today. So that means anybody using the Google Chrome web browser can actually run a Lighthouse audit on a site right from their web browser. And this can be really helpful for quickly understanding your site. I really like Lighthouse because the tool is relatively recent and new, which means it's tuned for modern performance practices. It's really actively worked on today, which means that any bugs or things that come up in it are quickly squashed. But the other thing is it's actually very stable in that today it's actually included directly in the Chrome web browser, and the kind of bar for a tool to be included directly in the browser is really high. So if you haven't tried running Lighthouse on your site to quickly understand your performance metrics, give it a shot. Another tool I wanted to give a shout out to is Web Page Test. So Web Page Test has less designers working on its interface, but it's an incredibly useful tool for developers to be able to quickly understand the profile of their site. So again, from a performance perspective, when you run web page tests on your site just by entering the particular URL of the page that you'd like to test, you're going to get back a bunch of metrics. In particular, some of the same metrics that we've been talking about and seeing with Lighthouse. There's just a couple things to know about web page tests that make it a little bit different than Lighthouse. So one of the things is, out of the box today, it's a little bit more tricky to share a Lighthouse result. So it's easier to run it on your own computer, but there's not necessarily a website you can just go to run a Lighthouse test and then share it with your colleagues. With web page tests, there's a publicly available instance of it that you can use to easily run tests and share with your colleagues. So this can be great for getting on the same page as far as performance goes. Web page test is also, significantly more configurable than Lighthouse, and that can be useful if you need some really specific behavior to maybe access your staging site or, run your performance profiling in a really particular way. One more thing to note is that web page tests can actually be used with actual devices. Sometimes you can get different results running things like Lighthouse on your computer and on actual end devices. So web page tests can actually be configured to run those tests directly against an iOS device or an Android device, which can be useful. So both web page tests and Lighthouse are great examples of laboratory tools, lab testing tools. The reason why they're lab testing tools is we're typically using them to test a subset of URLs. There's only so many URLs we can enter into these things. And we're also configuring really specific conditions. So here actually in this web page test result, you can see that we used a Motorola G4 phone to run the test. And we ran that on a particular network. So these results it's great that we have them, but they're also going to be very specific to that configuration. Somebody using an iPhone on a different network might get different results, as might somebody using a low-end Android device on a 3G network. And that's kind of where field testing comes in. So when we think about field testing, the big thing that we want to do is we want to be able to understand our performance across all of our different users. So field testing is sometimes called real user monitoring. And there's actually a number of vendors out there who have great proprietary solutions to approaching this. The tool that I wanted to focus on for field testing today, though, is actually a tool that Google is providing, free to folks. So in particular, since 2017, the Google Chrome web browser has actually been configured to send a bunch of telemetry data back to Google. So this is kind of creepy, but also kind of awesome, because what Google's actually done is they've made a subset of that data available to developers and folks to better understand the performance of their site across many devices. So kind of technically how this works is they're actually exposing this data set using their big query engine. But they've actually built a number of tools on top of that to make it a little more accessible for folks just getting started with performance. So in particular, one of the tools that's now been updated and configured to use Google's Chrome user experience benchmarks is their Page Speed Insights tool. So this new version has been relatively recently launched and has replaced the old lab testing version of this tool with now insights from all Google Chrome users. So here in particular, what we can see is that, when we enter a particular URL or site into this tool, we actually get page load distributions. So two metrics here for first contentful paint and DOM content loaded, not just for a single run of this tool, but actually for all runs of this in Chrome. And another interesting thing is we can actually see that, our speed is classified for folks. So here, what we can see is that 61% of users had a fast first contentful paint experience, while 12% of folks had a slow experience. So this can be really useful for understanding in the wild how your shoppers are actually experiencing things. Another tool that Google has released is their speed scorecard, which is really nice for quickly benchmarking the median speed of your site against competitors. So here in particular, you can add a number of domains. So if you're in athletics and, looking to compare yourself against other folks there, you can quickly add that. They provide some filters as well to allow you to focus in on data for specific regions or specific network conditions that you're interested in. These bits of field testing data can be really useful in addition to, your laboratory tests. Cool. So now let's actually talk a bit about taking some of those things we've learned about lab and field testing tools and applying them to make our website more performant. So one of the things that, I'm trying to decide if I find surprising or not at this point is that most folks that I talk to might be measuring web performance, but they're not actually enforcing it. Probably the number one thing that you can do, like if this was a list of 10 tips, the first 5 would be this one. The number one thing that you could do to start improving your web performance is to actually enforce web performance. So on development teams, it's very common to have tests that verify the functionality of your website before you can launch it. So when a developer has a change that they would like to deploy to production, it needs to first pass a test suite to ensure that the functionality that's expected to be there is there. If the change doesn't pass that test suite, it fails and is not able to be promoted to production. That way, the developer needs to go back and fix the issue before it can be released. And this fast feedback cycle about getting information about, why your functionality is broken is really useful at preventing regressions from making it out into the wild. So folks are already writing tests for functionality. There's no reason you can't also write tests for performance. And some of the tools that I mentioned earlier make it really easy to do that. So in particular for Lighthouse, it's very easy to include it today into an existing continuous integration flow. So if your team is already using continuous integration, one of the easiest ways to get started improving your performance is to just go ahead and baseline your entry pages with Lighthouse. One specific thing here, I mentioned entry pages, and the reason that I'm thinking about entry pages is actually getting started in this. You don't need to start with every single page. It's important to focus on where the biggest opportunity is. And entry pages are just so important because they set the tone for the experience that a shopper is going to have when they're navigating through your site. If somebody's going to bounce or leave your site before it even loads, they're going to do it on the entry page. So this is just such a great place for you to fix. Using Lighthouse, there's a number of different performance metrics that you have there. And I showed earlier, that tool to help understand it a little bit more. You need to just pick one of those metrics. So in particular, if I was to make a recommendation, for most sites, you're going to pick one of 2 things. You might be choosing, site speed. If you have a traditional web site, you might be choosing time to interact it if your site relies on JavaScript for a lot of interaction. So you need to pick one of those 2 metrics. The next thing that's kind of fun is, a lot of times people get caught up with the need to improve the speed of their site. I'd argue that that is less important than stopping the bleeding. So what you want to choose as your target is just whatever your current score is. You don't necessarily need to start off with the idea of making things faster. You just need to start off with the idea of not making things slower. So if you choose your existing score as your target, you're not creating a bunch of extra work for your team right off the beginning. But what you are doing is providing them a safety net. So if they make changes in the future that would regress, that would make performance worse, those changes will be rejected. One of the things about introducing performance testing for the first time is many teams aren't actually familiar with the sorts of things that would decrease performance. And so sometimes an innocent looking change can actually have a really large impact on performance. That's why it's so important to get this testing in there so that developers don't inadvertently add something that seriously reduces performance. So if there's kind of one thing to take away from this, it's make sure that some sort of performance monitoring is implemented into your process of releasing changes to production. So if you're lucky and have a team that practices continuous integration, running tests and things like that before things go live, this would be the perfect place to put it. If you're a team that has maybe checklists that you follow before things go to production, you can also do this by hand, running Lighthouse by hand, using the Chrome web browser and verifying those changes on your staging site before you push it out. Cool. So that's the first tip. Let's talk about the second one. So some of the things that I wanted to share with you today are things that you can do more easily, maybe without involvement of engineering or development teams to be able to fix things. One thing that folks are often surprised about is that third-party scripts, so different vendors and things that you might plug into your website using JavaScript, are often the cause of many performance regressions. These are some of those things that look super innocent when you put them on your site. Hey, just add this one line of code and you'll get all this additional functionality. But what that typically hides behind it is those things are going to go out and make requests for all kinds of different resources and things that can have a real impact on the performance of your site. One really cool and fast way to understand what impact some of these third-party scripts are having on your site is if you're using something like a tag manager to load all these things, just disable your tag manager, run Lighthouse, and compare it to a Lighthouse run when you have all those tags enabled. Usually the difference for most retailers and brands that we work with is vast, and you can really see some of the differences that makes in performance. Don't get me wrong, at the same time, all these scripts, a lot of them are very important from a business perspective, and they'll often deliver critical core functionality of sites, whether it's analytics, recommendations, and personalization, multivariate testing. But these things each come with a cost. If you're using a tool like a tag manager, one thing that'll often happen is this problem that I call the holiday 2009 problem. So it was holidays back in 2009. We wanted a really cool banner on the site. Maybe engineering was too busy to add it in. So, as a marketing team, we add that into the tag manager to have that holiday banner show up. So it's really easy to add those things into the tag manager. But over time, we accumulate things without owners or without a clear reason when they should be removed. So, we realize that in holiday 2018, we're still loading that holiday 2009 banner. So one of the things, like these simple things that you can do, is just kind of review and audit the set of third-party scripts you're loading. The first thing you want to do is make sure for each one of these things, you have an owner for them. So each one of those tags should have a clear owner on your team. If it doesn't have an owner, that's probably a good there's a good chance you can probably just delete it. You want to verify with that owner that the tag is still being used, and you want to cross-reference, your list of third-party tags for duplicates. And what I mean there is just, it's common that, especially in large organizations, you might be using similar pieces of software to achieve kind of the same results. This is the classic, I've got 3 tag managers on my website problem. So you want to just work to find any duplicates there. Once you've done that, you can run some further Lighthouse testing to identify the top offenders. So in particular here, what you'd be doing is you'd going into your tag manager, selectively enabling and disabling the different ones that you want, and looking at how your performance profile changes as you do that. Once you've got your hit list there with your top ones prioritized, you kind of review with engineering whether there's any alternative ways to load those scripts. So for a lot of these things, a lot of third-party integrations, they'll have multiple ways that you can approach integrations. And some folks are seeing really great performance benefits using asynchronous methods of loading these things or using different approaches there. kind of circling back around to the top, the thing you want to do here again with these third-party scripts is you want to break the cycle. So you want to make sure that your process for measuring and enforcing performance changes includes tag changes. So somebody is going to add a new tag to their website, it needs to go through that same performance vetting. Because again, these are the kinds of small changes, one, that typically happen outside of your regular development pipeline, and two, are the kinds of things that look very innocent, but actually end up having a significant performance impact. Cool, so let's move into the third tip then. It is 2018. I hope most folks are using a CDN. If you're not, obviously, think about using one. There's great services from Cloudflare, Fastly, Akamai is a fantastic company as well. You want to make sure that you're distributing your assets through a content delivery network so that the amount of actually physical distance that bytes need to travel from a shopper's device to your servers is as short as possible. I bring up CDNs because, as far as quick wins, they're such a fantastic resource, right after those third-party assets. One of the things you're going to want to do is just very quickly review that your resources are using your CDNs and review the cache policy of those resources. So Shopper's web browser maintains this local store, this cache of all the assets that it's previously encountered before. If you have your asset cache policies configured correctly, return visitors should see the site load very quickly. Or shoppers that are navigating between many pages, those subsequent page loads should be fast because your assets should be cached. They should be stored locally on the device. A tool like Lighthouse can help you see that. In particular, it will pull out resources that have a short cache time to live so that, by default cannot be cached for a long amount of time by a device, and it'll let you know about those. So you just want to double check that for your important assets, one, they're using it. Sometimes, in the really wildest case, we've seen assets being loaded, kind of hot linked off Dropbox and stuff. And sometimes it happens, right? You have to make a fast change to your site, and the ways that you can do that are limited. But you want to make sure that stuff gets pushed out over time. And you want to review those asset cache policies. So for the assets that are served through the CDN, are they being served in such a way that repeat visitors will be able to reuse the existing assets that they've downloaded? Finally, what you want to do is make sure to check in on your configuration of your CDN. There's a lot of really cool work here happening lately around HTTP2, a new protocol that's enjoying very widespread support right now. So you want to just make sure that your CDN provider is supporting those features and enabling them by default for you. So after those kind of quick wins, we get into things that are going to be a little bit more work for your team. When we were talking about measuring and enforcing performance, I wasn't necessarily saying that, you needed to go out and specifically try to make performance better. I was just saying you should try to make performance not worse. A great way to introduce teams to performance is the next time that you're thinking about making a large change. Maybe you're updating a product listing page, a product description page. Make a performance target for that change and work with your team to hit it. So in particular, the way that I'll often work with teams to do this is we'll start by trying to understand what target we want to hit. A lot of times, there is some diminishing returns on performance. You can do a lot of work, and not see great gains. So you just need to be clear what you're actually looking to hit and where you're going to stop. You can use that speed scorecard tool and or Lighthouse to profile the similar pages from your competitor. A simple goal is just to be the fastest, right? To have the best result from amongst your competitive set. When you're thinking about setting a performance target and actually have a team do work to hit it, it's really important to involve both engineering and design teams early. In particular, this is because many of the things that we do to actually aggressively try to hit a performance target involve trade-offs. So to give you some specific examples, it might mean not loading a custom branded font. It might mean, having less image assets immediately loaded. It might mean having certain third-party functionality not enabled for a particular page. So each of those things, involves trade-offs that needs the business to lay in on. You're also going to need engineering and design there just to kind of know what's possible, because the sorts of things that are going to improve your performance aren't always obvious. If you've been measuring your site for some time and enforcing it, your teams are going to have started to build some familiarity in what's going to impact the performance. So, it's just a great time for them to test out the knowledge that they've used. Once you've actually shipped that change, the key thing is to go back to those baselines that we set in the original kind of tip and make sure that we adjust them. We want to lower our baseline. Just thinking about a similar thing that I've introduced with teams before, sometimes I work with software teams that don't do testing. So testing is actually not part of their process. And the idea of introducing testing in one shot can be a little bit terrifying because we have all this code that's not tested. Are you saying that we now have to, upgrade it all to be tested code? The amount of work to do that can be significant. So the kind of trick there is to introduce the idea of only testing code adding tests for code that you changed. To use horrible metaphors, it's kind of like putting the frog in the pot of water and then slowly turning up the temperature. So rather than shocking the system by making these huge changes all at once, we can slowly improve the performance of pages over time by focusing on where we're making changes and setting performance targets on the specific pages that we're looking to make changes on. Just in terms of my last tip here today, we talked a bit about time to task completion earlier on. And, an area where I'm really focused on today is thinking about actually removing pages that we need to actually load from the flow, from the task flow. So, one way I think about this is the fastest web page to load is the one that you don't have to load. And a really cool thing that both Apple and Google have been working on lately is a set of technologies designed to remove repetitive interaction from web browsers and streamline it. So there's a bunch of these technologies coming out around both logins and speeding up the process of logging in with accounts, but also payments. So here, I just want to highlight some of the cool things that we're seeing going on in payments, because some of these things are also getting increasingly easy to enable working with your e-commerce provider and your payment gateway. Both Apple Pay and Google Pay, I think of them almost like autocomplete on steroids to some degree. But when you think about purchasing an item, they actually just remove steps that you'd normally have to go in. So instead of having to enter, billing details, instead of having to enter shipping details, I can press a button and complete the purchase. The interesting thing from that is you can actually totally shift, where a shopper might look to complete a purchase. So as opposed to having a regular checkout flow that, ends with a shopper navigating through a multi-step checkout, you can actually move that purchase button right up into the product description pages or even product listing pages. Kind of in the same vein, the payment request API is different from Apple Pay and Google Pay in that you don't actually need to work with your e-commerce provider or payment gateway to enable it. It just works with regular credit cards. But it's a really nice flow for quickly capturing shopper billing and shipping information. So talk to your team a little bit about enabling those things. I suggest them because they're simpler ways of removing steps from your overall process. Let's just switch gears a little bit. I want to talk quickly at the end about some of the technologies that Mobify is working with a little bit and how we're seeing them change the performance landscape. So, we're here today talking about performance, and part of the reason that we're doing that is customer expectations have changed. So shoppers are expecting native app-like behavior. They're expecting everything they interact with to be incredibly responsive and incredibly quick. And those, expectations are being set by large technology brands. How can folks actually keep up with that? And what exactly are those expectations? So, we've talked today about a bunch of performance metrics and things. And shoppers, they want fast experience that work incredibly quickly on any network. And they want kind of effortless interaction. So ways to complete their tasks, ways to complete their buying journeys without friction and very quickly. So two technologies that we're thinking about a lot at Mobify are progressive web apps and accelerated mobile pages. So for me, progressive web apps are really app-like experiences on the web. And a key piece of that is that they should be so fast that a shopper shouldn't be able to tell the difference between whether it's a native application or a web application. We're using a combination of technologies to achieve some really cool performance gains there. In particular, kind of outside the scope of the presentation that we went into today, I'm really excited about recent advances in single-page apps and service workers. These two technologies really change up the model for the set of things that's possible in web browser performance. One thing I'm particularly excited about is the idea of pushing optimistic actions to more shoppers. So this is the idea that, as a shopper is navigating through their buying journey, their buying flow, we actually don't need to wait for a response from a server to actually render things for shoppers. And accelerated mobile pages is another really cool technology being pushed out by Google. Some of the things that I was mentioning earlier as performance best practices, auditing your third-party assets, making sure you're using a CDN. These are things that come out of the box with accelerated mobile pages. Google's allowing folks to use their CDN to distribute the pages. And AMP as a specification has some interesting limitations that actually make it very difficult to build a poor performing site. So I'm really excited about how these two technologies are changing up the shape of the performance landscape on the web. So, that's pretty much it. Just a quick recap of things today. We talked about different kinds of performance metrics. We talked about how shoppers perceive performance. We dug into a couple tools, in particular some lab and field testing tools for measuring that performance. And then we talked about some tips for improving performance. Lastly, I shared a couple of the things that I'm excited about in the future as far as progressive web apps and accelerated mobile pages go in terms of improving performance. So we've got some time left here at the end. I'd love to answer any questions that folks have.
Great, thanks, John. So before we jump into these questions, just a reminder that you can submit any that you might have with the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So we have a couple here on Lighthouse. The first is, can you use Lighthouse for desktop or tablet sites, or is it a mobile-specific tool?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Lighthouse does have configuration options that allow it to test with other screen sizes and configurations. So by default, Lighthouse is actually configured to run on a slow Android device on a slow network. Which is why sometimes folks can be surprised at the speed numbers that they get when they're first using Lighthouse, because it's really trying to give you the long tail of performance. But you can configure it with different screen sizes as well as different network speeds, and that can be useful if you're looking at performance across kind of different groups of users.
Okay, great. And then maybe as an expansion on that, is Lighthouse a tool specific for PWAs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So no, Lighthouse is not a tool that's specific for PWAs. When I briefly flash that Lighthouse results, you'd actually see that there's 5 categories of things there. One of them in particular is around progressive web apps. But all the other categories are relevant to any website. So you have things like performance, best practices, SEO, and accessibility. And those are things that are perfect to measure and track for any website.
Cool. The next one is on time to task completion. How should I determine what tasks to measure in a time to task completion study? And is there a way to automate that test?
Yeah, great question. I didn't really go into time to task completion tests in detail today. We have a lot of great resources that I'm sure that we can share after this. But just to take that specific question, so when you think about what tasks you should start testing, think about what the goal of your web property is, and start with the biggest goal that you have. So if you're a brand or retailer, that might be that you want a shopper to complete a purchase on your site. So start with that large task. And then after you've kind of baselined that, you can think about whether there's other smaller tasks that make that up. So it might be the case that folks need to find a particular item. It might be the case that folks need to enter their payment and shipping details. So you might look at smaller subsets of that if you're curious about that. Was there a second part to that question, Madalena? I just wanted to double check that I answered it.
You're right. There is a second part. Is there a way to automate those tests?
Yeah, great question. So, I'm personally an engineer, and I sometimes strongly dislike talking to real people. So I asked the same question, right? Is there a way to automate those tests? But actually, time to task completion, I find it is a great test for doing in person with folks. So a lot of people can be intimidated by running a user experience test for the first time. But there is really something enlightening about locking yourself in a room with another human being, as they navigate their way through your work, and seeing them make all kinds of mistakes that are actually your fault as the person who built that at the end of the day. So I would suggest that folks look at this as a way to actually build and fold some real user testing with actual people and actual devices into their flow. It can be a very enlightening experience. Now, for time to task completion, we're not necessarily talking about testing this with hundreds of people. The sample size that you're looking at is somewhere between 5 to 10. Because you're looking at doing those tests with actual folks, you're not going to be able to run it at the same cadence that you would, some of your lab testing tools that are going to run on every commit. But you're going to be running it, when you're thinking of making a major change to your flow, or you're going to be running it to build a baseline that you can use to, guide action in the future.
Yeah, that's a great point. So how frequently do you recommend we audit our third-party scripts?
Great question. So to give you another example of this that I just think is fun, I talk a lot to our teams about SaaS services. So SaaS, software as a service services, are so great. Anybody can sign up with them with their credit card, and then we've got that service. And then at the end of the year, finance comes around and says oh, hey, did you know we signed up for these 400 services? And everybody's like, whoa, I totally forgot that we signed up for that thing. We've been using it for the last 11 months we have not been using it for the last 11 months. The person who bought it is gone. So third-party scripts are kind of like the same thing, right? For finance and SaaS, what I recommend is use a credit card with a really short expiry date. So it expires, and then if somebody's actually using it, they get the expiry emails and need to go back and renew the service. So you want something like that for your third-party scripts. And I'm not going to go so far as to say that you should. So, my evil engineering way is you'd wrap the tags for your third-party scripts in kind of self-destructive code that would say after a certain time, don't execute this anymore. And so what that would mean is folks would need to check in and verify that they're still using these things every little while. But in terms of how often you should audit it, right? I think the first thing is make the hurting stop, make the bleeding stop. And what that means is anytime someone is going to add a new tag, just make sure that it goes through your performance monitoring process. So that's probably the most important thing to do. It's change your process such that when you're adding or making changes to these scripts, those changes are validated through performance. Now, if you have more time and you can do kind of a thorough audit, right, it's going to kind of depend on your organization. At the far end, to give you a maximum range, you want to be doing this once every year. So, set up a Slack reminder, set something in your Google Calendar, a reoccurring event to do this every year. Depending on how much change you're seeing there, you're going to want to shrink that. I think if teams were doing this more than every 3 months, I'd be maybe worried about why we're making so many changes in our tag manager. So, at a minimum, I think like quarterly, at a maximum, at a fastest iteration rate, I think quarterly. At, the longest you should possibly go is probably a year.
Okay, great. That's all we have for questions for now. And if you did have anything that we didn't answer, feel free to send them to hello@mobify.com. We will also be sending a recording of this webinar, so you can simply reply to that email too if you had any outstanding things that you wanted to ask John or the team. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you so much, John.
Thank you, everyone, and have an amazing day.